Hello, my name is James Arroyo, and welcome to Chapter 4, Perceiving Others. Previously, we've been discussing how interpersonal communication affects the self through self-concept and self-esteem. Now we're going to be diving into how we perceive others. So, let's dive right in. We start with the perception process in general. Reality is constructed through communication, and there are two orders of realities. There are first order realities. These are physical, observable realities, like the sky is blue, the water is wet, and those things that exist out there in the world. There are 5 people there versus second order reality, which are the meanings that we attach to certain situations. For example, this may be what are that is my group of friends. That would be a second order reality, whereas the first order reality is simply there are 5 people there. We also have the sky is not first order reality would be that the sky is blue. The second order reality would be that the sky is beautiful. So there are first order realities and second order realities, and these second order realities tend to be very impactful on us. So, what are some of the meanings we have associated with the Super Bowl? The first order reality would be that two groups of people are hitting each other. That being said, the second order reality would be all of the meaning associated, the plays, what the plays mean, which team is going to win, things like that, as well as why we watch it, that some people may see it as the game, other people might see it as the commercials. So there are 4 big parts of the perception process: selection, selecting of information, organizing that information, and interpreting that information. All of that are the personal constructions that we make in the perception process. But there is a 4th one, and this one is especially created through communication, and that is negotiation. So let's dive right in. We start with the selection process, and that information that has higher intensity, repetition, and contrast or change are more likely to be perceived than that which is not any of those things. We start with intensity. Larger, louder, or brighter attracts more attention. So, a good example of this, and a morbid example of this, is that more people die due to obesity than there have ever been who died of terrorist attacks. So, this is not to say that we should not be careful of either of these, but that we tend to hold a greater value or a greater fear of this type of terrorist attacks than we do about obesity. Next, we have repetition. Repetitious stimuli can also attract our attention. So when we see something over and over and over and over again, then we tend to perceive that more often. Another example of this, and this is where we get into some selection bias, that if, for example, I have this perception of a certain group being bad drivers, let's say LA drivers, and then every time that I see an LA driver cutting someone off, then I would automatically say, oh, there goes that LA driver cutting me off. Instead of, oh, that one driver cut me off and all of the other drivers around me were actually totally fine. So that is a second part of selection, in that when we already have a preconceived notion about how something should work, then we end up seeing more of it. And then lastly, we have contrast or change. That whatever your political beliefs are, that the healthcare system before Obamacare was very, very, very bad. to the point where if you got these two fingers cut off, this one would be cheaper to replace than this one by like $20 to $30,000 if you didn't have health insurance. So that the lack of change is something that doesn't really affect us all that much. The fact that a system is really, really, really bad, that is something that we don't really see very much. But when that system then changes to something else, then that is more perceived than the things that have just always been, even though they may be awful. The next step in the selection process is then organizing that information. So once we have selected information, maybe there's something that's very vivid, that changed quite a bit from what I expected, then we organize it. And there's 4 perceptual schema. Schema are interconnected bits of information, and we have massive amounts that when I touch the stove, I'm going to burn. That old people are a certain way, young people are a certain way. That we always have these perceptual schemas, and the way that we organize them in which type of schema is going to change how we perceive that information. Physical involves old or young. So what are the physical associations with physical differences? Next, we have role-based differences. This is student or spouse or teacher or principal or boss. All of which are role-based. So, for example, if your boyfriend or girlfriend talks to you, or maybe an older person, actually, let's talk physical, that if an older person talks to you and you don't know them from Adam, then you're going to have some certain perceptual schema associated with how young people and old people should interact. But then let's say that you are an older person's boss. At that point, then the role-based schema might be the way that we would have to perceive information from that person. We also have interaction-based. This involves how we interact. Was someone rude? Was someone helpful? Was someone inconsiderate? Was someone very considerate? So now we're talking about the more individual stuff. And then we have psychological. This is the person outgoing, or are they crazy? Are they insane? Are they really intelligent? So the way that we organize information is going to determine what that information really means. For example, let's say that one of your friends ends up doing something very stupid. Maybe they decide, you know what, at midnight tonight, let's all go get Taco Bell. That actually isn't all that silly. That being said, what perceptual schema are you going to observe that through? If they're rather young, then you're like, yeah, okay, young people tend to do this sort of stuff. We're all good. What if it is you're the parent and that person is a child? Then is that going to change the meaning? If that person is a parent, how is that going to change the perception? First, would that, if they ask other people to join them, would that be considered as young stuff, or would that be considered as rude? Or is it a personality, a psychological characteristic of the person to go out to Taco Bell at 12 p.m. at night? So the way that we organize the information is going to affect how we perceive that information. And within that organization, we end up having some punctuations. Punctuations are determination of cause and effects in a series of interactions. So, for example, a husband argues with a wife. The husband perceives the wife's argument as a nag. Then the wife complains, the husband withdraws, and then the husband and wife argue more because the wife perceives that the husband's withdrawing. So each partner's punctuation affects perceptions of the dispute, and as a result, they continue to follow this sort of pattern, and that's what can happen when we end up organizing information through a certain perceptual schema instead of having to instead of trying to change up how we perceive, to rethink some of the things we may already know. A good example of this is this situation, because if you focus on a role-based perceptual schema, how should a husband treat a wife? What are some of the preconceived notions about wives talking to husbands and husbands talking to wives? There is a lot of baggage and perceptions there that may not be entirely accurate. Next, we have interpretation. How do we attach meaning to sense data? Organization helps with this, but we actually attach meaning to it, and there are many considerations associated with this. There's relational satisfaction. If the relationship is very good and both people are satisfied within that relationship, then of course you're going to end up having positive perceptions of that situation. Also, we have expectations. How should a wife act? How should a husband act? How should a friend act? How should I feel in this situation? All of which are expectations that when not met, that can make us feel sad. When they are met, they can make us feel happy. But all of which to say that those expectations can affect our interpretation of certain sense data. We also have personal experience. Have we perceived situations like this before? We also have personality. Some people are just very happy people and end up having the same meaning for a lot of the stuff, versus personality on the opposite side where everything is personal or could be perceived as personal. And then we even have assumptions about human behavior. There are two basic assumptions towards human behavior, and this is going way, way, way back with Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Thomas Hobbes saw people as, as overarchingly selfish and self-interested, whereas John Locke perceived people as overall good in nature and would be willing to work with people. Which way do we see? Do we see people as bad? Do we see people as good? This can obviously change people's interpretations of sense data. Let's say that maybe there is a multi-trillionaire. How do you perceive them? Do you perceive them as greedy and rich and just trying to make money at the expense of everyone else? Or do you see them as potentially someone who is building a lot of business for a lot of people, giving a lot of people jobs, and is donating to charity whenever possible? That assumptions about human behavior can affect many of our perceptions. And then lastly, and this is the co-created section, negotiation. Process by which communicators influence each other's perceptions through communication. Because if we did not have an ability to negotiate our perceptions, then we would keep our perceptions the same at all times. And that is not a good way of going about the world. Are you 100% sure that your attributions are correct? We should say no, because we we have to be able to interact with others. And as a result, if there is no negotiation of perceptions, then what ends up happening is that there is constant fight between these perceptions. Narratives are one of the big ways that we co-create meaning. Personal stories created to make sense of our personal world. Uh, one of my one of the most interesting are heroes or victims, and then villains narratives. That I am the helpless victim in this situation. That the boss is treating me very unfairly, or my boyfriend or girlfriend is treating me very unfairly. I have done nothing wrong in this situation, and as a result, I am the helpless victim in this. Whereas the other person is a villain, uncaring, inconsiderate, and doesn't want anything to do with anything unless it serves them in some way, shape, or form. That these narratives can be very toxic, and if there is a strong negotiation process, then that narrative can very rarely occur, but when it doesn't happen, then it's very easy for this to be perceived, because what it is actually very self-satisfying. Because if I am the helpless victim, that means that I have done nothing to make this bad situation occur. Whereas they have been entirely to blame. They have full responsibility for this bad situation. I have no responsibility whatsoever. And just like that, I've rationalized away my responsibility for this situation. And I would argue that in every conflict, every poor situation, both people are responsible for it, at least in some part. Next, we have shared narratives. We have a lot of shared narratives, like this heroes and victims versus villains narrative, but there are many more ways that we should act. So, in summary, this is the perception process. First, we select information. Then we organize it in our perceptual schemas. Then we interpret it using those considerations like relational satisfactions, beliefs of human experience. Then lastly, we negotiate those experiences. That when I communicate something about how I think that all girlfriends or boyfriends are um, uncaring, and I communicate that to my boyfriend or girlfriend, uh, then that would obviously then be negotiated. There would be a conversation about that when I communicate it. Next, we talk about the influences on these perceptions, and there are four big influences on them: access, psychological, social, and cultural. Let's start with access, and access is very easy. That if we have information, it can shape our perceptions. If we do not have access to information, then of course it is not going to influence our perceptions. And that is very easily how people of high socioeconomic status can, and those of low socioeconomic status, can end up not having a perception, or that the experiences of either side would not affect their perceptions. That they would only see their world from their bubble. If we don't have that information, then it cannot shape our perceptions. Next, we have physiological influences, senses, See, hear, taste, touch, smell. All of those, if we do not have them, we cannot have that information. We do not have access to that information, and as a result, it does not shape how we see the world. Um, also, so in general, if I am blind or deaf, then that's going to shape the perceptions that I have about certain people. Maybe someone who's very, 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 very loud, I would not like as much as someone who's more quiet if I am deaf. Possibly. Next, we have age. Age is is that throughout when we get older, we end up having different physiological influences. What are some of the what are some of the things that happen to us when we are 13 through 15, maybe slightly earlier, maybe slightly later? We go through puberty, and obviously that's going to affect how we perceive things. Also, how has your perceptions of your parental figures changed as you've grown up? Obviously, it has changed quite a bit because maybe when we were little, they were role model. Maybe as we grow older, maybe they're still a role model, but there is some conflict. Maybe as we grow as old as they were when they raised us, maybe we begin understanding, maybe even have a friend relationship. So, parental figures, the meaning of it, uh, can change due to our age. We also have health and fatigue. How does sleep deprivation affect our perceptions? Quite a bit. So we end up being affected by our mental and physical state. Also, we have biological cycles. How are you in the morning versus in the night? That is going to influence your perceptions on a physiological level. Also, hunger. When you are hangry, are you able to think well? Not really. This also speaks to one of the big challenges of school lunches are those who have um, food insecurity or even who live in food deserts, that not eating good food can obviously affect someone on a physiological level, change their perceptions of school, of of family, of all sorts of things, and therefore set them up for failure in those situations. Lastly, we have neurobehavioral challenges like bipolar and ADHD, all of which are physiological influences on our perceptions. We also have mood. Mood can also affect our self concept. For example, if I am riding my bike and a bus almost hits me and I swerve off and I run into a bush, then if I have a bad mood or a bad attitude, I could very easily, and rightfully so, say, geez, what a moron. I almost got hit by that guy and they didn't even stop. Oh my gosh, what a jerk. And I'm super scraped up, so now I'm late and I'm gonna look messy, and oh my gosh, there's all these things wrong with the day now. Or maybe perceiving it in a slightly different way than would be natural. Man, I dodged that bus so quick, my reflexes are amazing. And not just did I dodge it, I also landed in this soft bush so that I didn't scrape myself more than I could have. Yeah, I'm going to be running a little bit late, but I'm going to tell everyone at work about this story. So, in so doing, our mood can shape our perceptions of things. When you interact with your boyfriend or girlfriend, how does your mood affect your interaction with them? That obviously is going to influence our perceptions. So when, let's say I'm in a bad mood and my girlfriend ends up talking to me about, you know, about their day and how awful it was, and I'm already in a bad mood, then I may see that as complaining and whining when I had a much worse day. Versus if I was in a good mood, I may perceive that as they are asking for, well, they want to share. They want to share with me because of great affection. Next, we have self-concept, how we see ourselves. When I play video games, I have a very high self-concept and self-esteem and self-efficacy, how well I will do in video games. So I feel of myself as quite a video gamer, especially with Halo. So when I lose at Halo, that runs counter to my perceptions of myself. So what ends up happening is that I then get mad. I get frustrated because here's where I am. Here's where I believe I am. This is what this sense data is telling me where I am. And that's not right, obviously. Obviously, that's not right. The ranking system is messed up. My controller wasn't working, and the input lag on my TV is awful. Not to mention the internet is horrible. So therefore, it is not my fault. It is other people's fault. It's other situational factors that have caused me to lose. Whereas if I didn't see myself as quite a video gamer, then I may say, "Ha, yep, I'm not very good at this game. That's okay. You're just better at this game than I am." And then we also now have social influences that affect our perceptions. Standpoint theory states that describes how a person's position in society shapes his or her view of society in general and of specific individuals. So it is very hard to imagine the perspective of those who have been treated badly due to their race, gender, and socioeconomic status, because we have a certain standpoint in society. So, a good example of this is that I was raised in a fairly well-to-do area, very middle class, and as a result, I saw things in a certain way that there were that maybe there, like, one good example of this was way back in the day during Hurricane Katrina. I had the distinct idea, why is it that they just don't move? Why don't they move? I mean, they see a hurricane coming, so why don't they just get out of the way? But I then realized later on down the line that that's not right, because some people maybe cannot afford to move. Maybe some people live in bad neighborhoods where they would be broken into if they moved. Or even that those who are older may not be physically able to move. So just like that, I've realized that my social influences have created a certain perspective, have influenced my perception on a lot of things. So that is very much the way that standpoint theory works. We also have sex, or biological, and gender, masculine and feminine, roles. So we perceive masculine and feminine women differently in the same way we perceive feminine and masculine men differently as well. So these roles of what is expected of man and woman in society, and that those ideas that we already have influence our perceptions on our interactions with these people. Next, we have more social influences. Occupational roles. How do we perceive and behave differently in our jobs? Maybe in your personal life, you may be very one way, and in your job, you may be a very different way. I remember when I used to work at the Target boutique back in high school, a lot of my friends came over and came to see me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's funny. So, and we all took pictures and everything, and we all joked around a little bit. Then I saw my manager looking at me, and I'm like, okay, I'm sorry, I have to get back to work. So, I would have never shut it down like that if I was not working at the time. And I behaved very differently in my role at my job at Target because I was not a very good Target team member. I didn't enjoy being a Target team member. So as a result, that really affected a lot of my perceptions happening at Target versus when I was just a friend. We also have, therefore, relational roles. How do we perceive and behave differently in our families, friend groups, romantic and social relationships? And when in a relationship, perceptual downgrading can occur, where we end up seeing others outside of the relationship as less than. This is especially in friend groups, but even in romantic relationships, where the other people outside of it are not as good as what I have right here as a self improvement exercise. And then lastly, we have culture. Culture are our values, beliefs, and behavior. And culture, as we've probably discussed before, affects everything. It affects all of our perceptions and is very shown through this, that our values, is talk valuable or is silence valuable? How valuable is money in our culture? How valuable is relationship in our culture or feelings in our culture? How valuable are working together versus working competitively? We value certain things in certain ways, and as a result, we perceive the world based on those values. In some cultures, talk is highly valuable. That when someone is talking, that is something that we hope to strive for. Whereas if someone is talking too much, or they are perceived to be talking too much through a cultural lens, then of course that would be perceived in a much more negative way. We also have beliefs. Should people be unique? Should people be the same? What is global climate change real? Is global climate change not so real? Those sorts of beliefs are very much affecting our perceptions as well. And then also, what are some of the behaviors that are appropriate and effective? In the business culture, a lot of times in some organizations, it is cutthroat that if someone gets taken advantage of in a business situation, then that is just playing the game. That is fine. The other person should have been more cautious, buyer beware. Whereas in other cultures, that behavior would be seen as very, very negative. Even within our culture, that might be seen as a little bit negative. So that concludes the influences of perception. In the next section, we're going to be talking about attributions. Have a wonderful day.